share with me if it's too long or too heavy. I don't know. Anyway, being that it's Erev Shabbos, I felt like that a good place to get started and to look for any thoughts to build for this evening was really from the Parsha. And luckily or coincidentally or 100% appropriate, it was very appropriate. Parshas Vayechi opens up with a topic that we all know was important in my mother's eyes. Within the first few psukim, I could read it to you or just give you a quick summary, is that Yaakov knew that he was soon going to die, so he called his son Yosef, asked him to promise not to bury him in Mitzrayim. Yaakov requested that he should be buried with his fathers, and then at the end Yosef swore that he's going to keep up to this. We can learn a lot from the Lashon, the wording of this conversation. For starters, why did Yaakov call Yosef out of all the brothers? So Yaakov understood that this wasn't a simple request. The culture of Mitzrayim was really to worship the dead bodies. So taking out a mace would not be simple, and in order to guarantee that this will be done, he had to ask Yosef, because he knew that he had the power to do it, and that there would probably be a challenge to actually carry it out. Then Yaakov chooses his words very carefully, and he goes, Imna matzati chen be'enecha. And as he continues the rest of the conversation, we see the word na, which means please, 3 times. As his father, Yaakov easily could have commanded this request. Right, kids? We could just command things, we don't have to say things. But instead, he chose to ask. And the question is why? And Yaakov understood human nature. He goes, if we give somebody a command, if we're told we have to, we tend to find excuses and arguments we might want to do. We might do it at the end, but it's not with a happy heart. But if you ask somebody to do a favor, then the attitude changes, and then compassion leads us to want to fulfill the request, especially one that's this important. There's a saying that says rules are made to be broken, and we can continue that with thinking that favors are really made to be kept. When someone asks a favor, you seldomly say, I'm not doing it. And as much as this dialogue starts off as a request between Yaakov and Yosef, you should note that by the end, Yaakov did pressure Yosef and said, swear it to me. And Yosef did it. And why did Yaakov do that? And we can continue our thought of saying that a promise is made to be kept as well. And we're going to see later on that that was also necessary because Paro respected that, which he might have otherwise given him a hard time. My mother really understood this notion of asking in place of commanding. And my kids, it was very clear to me and Ellie, every time she would come, she'd sit at a kitchen table, and Ellie would usually laugh about it because she would sit there and she often needed help to get something, I don't know, a book from the other room or a drink or something, and she'd sit there and she'd turn to the kids and sweetly she'd go, Mamala, or Tiako, she'd go, Tatala, can you please get me? And then, as if there was a chance the kids, she would be asking them a favor, and they would never have said no. And it was really wonderful of them to always be there and to be able to fulfill whatever she needed. And, they felt that they were fulfilling a favor and she really needed their help. And it was a nice opportunity for them to be there for her. And back to the Parsha. As Yaakov continues his request to Yosef, he asked him, Vasita imadi chesed ve'emes. This is the well-known source that provides us with the lesson that doing something for a mace is a true kindness, because there'll be absolutely no reciprocation. If we look at the letters of emes, the aleph is aleph, the mem is mita, and the taf is tachwichim. These items are all essential to carrying out a mate, and the word emes really symbolizes the true service one does for a mate. I think at this point there will be a great opportunity to thank Ephraim and Pepi, who understood the chesed that they were doing for the mate and really providing her true wish. And she can't reciprocate, just know that the family is extremely grateful for it. Now that we've established the tone of the discussion, what exactly was Yaakov asking from Yosef? The first part of the request, he said, is Alna, again the na, tikveni b'Mitzrayim. He didn't want to be buried in Mitzrayim. And very simply, Rashi gives a few reasons. He goes, well, Yaakov knew that the soil of the Mitzrayim is going to be filled with kinu. The kinu is going to crawl beneath the dead bodies, and that's not covered. Yaakov also was aware that being buried outside of Eretz Yisrael might have to provide him with a long journey at Tchiat HaMetzim. And lastly, he mentions that he was just worried about his body becoming a Avodah Zarah, and clearly he wanted to avoid this possibility. But the second part of his request is he was saying where he did want to be buried. He said, he clearly wants to be buried with his fathers, and this was his goal. As we all know, my mother possessed a great love of Eretz Yisrael. Yes, her daily life wasn't Chutz La'aretz, but just like Yaakov, she understood the proper place for Jewish burial was in Eretz Yisrael. To tie this week's Haftorah, Melachim Aleph, Parak Bet, David gives Shlomo a list of instructions that he should carry out upon his death. Most of it was showing things or pay back to people, but it was the idea that you give these instructions. When my mother was nervous about the state of her health and recognized the possible risk she was under, she gave us clear instructions. She wished to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, were all her reasons as deeply thought out as Yaakov's. Did she take into account that she didn't want to be buried in unholy soil? Did she foresee the hope for Tchiyas HaMesim? Or did she just want to be closer to her parents' burial place? Or maybe she had different reasons altogether, and the exact answers we don't know, we can only guess, but I'm sure each part of it was strong in her heart. The idea of being buried in Eretz Yisrael, as much as the original source comes from Yaakov and Yosef, it's also discussed a few places in Gemara. I'm not going to claim I learned them. I came across a lengthy article by Rav Naftali Balanson that ties many ideological sources that support this practice. I'll attempt to approach this in as condensed of a discussion as possible, but it makes sense still. Basically, the Gemara states that the idea anyone being buried in Eretz Yisrael is considered to be buried beneath the Mizbeach, and this is based on two psukim combined together. The first is in Shemot, where it says Mizbeach Adonai Ta'aseli, and the second is in Devarim, it was the end of Hazinu, where it says V'kaper Adonai Amo. Focusing on the word earth in both psukim, we understand that being buried in Eretz Yisrael is a kapara. It's supposed to give you atonement, and the earth of Eretz Yisrael has a cleansing quality, similar to that of the karbanot and mizbeach that we were used to bringing. So it ties it all together, and we can understand that being buried in Eretz Yisrael is like being buried under the protection of the kisar kavod. You get the cleansing, and you get the atonement, and you get this kedusha. The mizbeach can be seen as a kedusha ta'aretz, and the adama activates the tahara, as mentioned, v'chiperat mato. These psukim together really bring together the creation of man from earth, and obviously was in complete purity, and the return of the body back to earth, which is in complete purity. Another reason mentioned in the Gemara that supports the importance of being buried in Eretz Yisrael is very well known, but its details are very unclear to us. And that's the concept of Tchiyas HaMesim, which Rashi mentioned was one of Yaakov's intentions as well. In Yecheskel it mentions that only those in Eretz Yisrael will be zocher for Tchiyas HaMesim. In other sources it says that those outside Eretz Yisrael, only tzaddikim will be zocher. And some sources go to discuss that those buried outside Eretz Yisrael will need to make a long and treacherous journey to get back to Eretz Kedosha, and only then, sometimes, maybe it'll be treacherous for the tzaddikim, maybe not, and the discussion continues and nobody agrees. But this whole discussion brings us back to our parsha. Yaakov and Yosef knew they were tzaddikim. What were they so worried about? They would be zocha. But at the end, it's really the fact that they, because it was unclear, it's unclear to us, it was unclear to them, the Gemara, it might have been unclear to them as well, and they didn't want to take a chance. So it fell that high up on their importance of wanting it. It's also interesting to note that Yaakov and Yosef's desire to be buried in Eretz Yisrael stemmed from two very different places, and were carried out very different ways. Part of Yaakov's request had been to be buried with his father. This was one of his core reasons. Also, he was lucky to be buried immediately, or upon his death. They had a few days that he was in Mitzrayim, but then they went back to Eretz Yisrael. Whereas Yosef gave no indication to wanting to be buried in Maratach Pela, he just wanted to be in Eretz Yisrael. And his burial was unable to happen immediately. Instead, his body served as a symbol of national redemption, because as we see, his bones were carried through Yetziat Mitzrayim, then the Midbar, and then finally through Kiva Sha'aris, before he was actually allowed the honor of being buried. So to simply sum this up, when a person makes the conscious decision to make it a priority to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, as my mother did, is a recognition of the true value of Kedusha of the land, and the land's ability to provide final atonement, a final kapara. It can be seen as the person's final devotion to Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. My mother not only had this devotion and her insistence about being buried here, she had it in every aspect of her life. A simple example of this was seen in her desire to make it to shul as often as possible. As a young child, I know you guys think I'm annoying, but really, you should have been there. As a young child, I remember how seriously she felt about tefillah, especially during the Yom HaNoraim. No talking, no moving, you cannot leave, But she was very devoted to it. And even after it became difficult for her to get to shul on Shabbos, she made every effort to make it happen, especially on Shabbos Mevorchim and the Chagim. And this was her way to continue to connect with her constant avodat Hashem. I'm sure that every one of us can think back and remember a situation where we were able to witness her devotion to avodat Hashem. And I hope that those memories continue to stay strong among us.